Okay, this is going to be Tricia recording my life history from childhood, which the picture shows is about, I guess, 2 years old, to my young age on Eastern Parkway and my life in Brooklyn. We will ad-lib an hour probably each day. It could be very dull, but it could be interesting at points.
I'll point.
Today is March the 17th, the year 2004. And Tricia is doing a series of videos where I'm going to explain my life, probably going back to my earliest memory and taking it on an ad-lib basis. So I may have time frames that go forward and then time frames that go back as other facts come up. So we're going to start probably in the year 1930, which would make it 2 years old. I was born on June 14th, 1928. Now in 1928, and by the way, I'm going to not only talk about me, I'm going to speak about the times because it's relevant when I grew up and how we each spend our life. The time and era we live in sort of dictates in part how we live. And I was born prior to the Depression. 1928 was still a booming time of flappers and boom, and the market was very high. And the Depression didn't come until the market busted in 1929, October, I believe. Now, I was born in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. I guess maybe at the Williamsburg Hospital, for all I know. And at the age of 2, we moved to Eastern Parkway. Now, I don't have any memories of Williamsburg because prior to 2 years old, things get a little fuzzy. Eastern Parkway, well, let's go to New York City first and Brooklyn. Williamsburg was downscale. In other words, it wasn't Eastern Parkway. Eastern Parkway was upscale. There were sections of Brooklyn that were, quote, for the elite, which we didn't know it at that time, and there were sections that were less elite. Rent at Eastern Parkway was about $25 a month. Rent in Williamsburg could have been for a one-bedroom $17 a month. Rent on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in some of the slum areas could have been $10 a month. Eastern Parkway was a very special place to live. We had a park in front of us and a wide street, but we weren't rich. So why did we move to Eastern Parkway? Well, because my grandmother and aunts lived on Eastern Parkway. And in those days, the relatives stayed close by. More so than today. Today we're lucky our family's all together. But in those days, if your aunts and uncles lived in a certain building, then you tried to move in. And the building we moved into was 1004 Eastern Parkway. It was across the street from a subway, which meant you didn't have to walk. It was across the street from the elementary school. It had flowers, it had trees, it had a park. But we lived on the top floor. Well, today if you live on a high floor, it's more expensive. But in those days, there were walk-ups, there were no elevators. So the higher the floor, the less expensive it was. So we lived on the 4th floor. Now, there was a code of building. It started out probably slightly before in the 20s. In the Lower East Side and the older sections of Brooklyn and New York, you could build a 5-story building without an elevator. You can build a 6-story probably without an elevator because they didn't have elevators. But by the time they got to building in Eastern Parkway, they could not build any more than 4 flights up without an elevator. So all of the houses basically, or 90% of them, were 4-story buildings. And the top floor was the cheapest. The ground floor was the most expensive. If you lived in the back, which means your windows faced the alley, you paid $5 less. So you paid less for the floor. So we lived in the back on the 4th floor. My grandmother and aunts lived opposite us, but they faced the front. Now, down on the floor below us was an uncle, a cousin, my grandmother's brother or something, who was a girdle manufacturer, ladies' girdles, today who knows what. And down on the main floor in the building next to us, but had the same courtyard, was my Tante Becky. Tante meant aunt. Becky was I believe my grandmother's sister. So we had 5 aunts and uncles, and grandma and grandpa, which didn't speak any English, grandma and grandpa, so I never knew what they were thinking. And Tante Becky had a son, which I forget his name, and he, I believe, had a child, and then the people downstairs, so it was all family. And now we'll discuss, before we go into my relationship with the family, we'll discuss how we lived. Our apartment really had only 1 bedroom, and there were 6 of us. And the 6 of us lived because the dining room was my mother and father's bedroom. And I slept in the same area. And the 5 aunts and uncles, there were 2 uncles and 3 aunts, and they lived across the way. So they had 1 bathroom and 2 bedrooms, and they were 7. We were 6 with 1 bathroom and 1 bedroom and a dining room. And it was small. They were small, but we weren't living in poverty. We were living like everyone else lived, because that's the way people lived in those days. We didn't know anyone didn't live that way. And the houses were clean, and they had windows. That's another thing. On Eastern Parkway, you couldn't have a room without a window. Even your bathroom had a window. On the Lower East Side, where the Jewish people moved when they came from Europe, they had no windows, no toilets. I went to visit an aunt. We used to go away once a year to visit an aunt on the Lower East Side. Her toilet was in the hallway for 4 other families. And some of them didn't even have that. They had 1 toilet in the whole building. And this is this is not 1,000 years ago. This is, we'll say, 70 years ago. So we were living in a very nice area. Oh yeah, Tante Itta, Aunt Itta, Great Aunt Itta, that was her name, lived with no toilet. And she had no windows in 2 of the rooms. She only had windows in the front. She may have paid $10 a month. And she had a daughter who had a candy store in Chinatown, the only Jewish lady with a candy store on Mott Street in Chinatown. So once a year we'd go to Chinatown and get a free soda, and we would see Jenny, Cousin Jenny. My mother's name was Jenny, but this was another Cousin Jenny. Cousin Jenny was kind of heavy. The candy store was kind of small. Cousin Jenny was big. And she had like 3 boxes. The whole store was only 10 feet wide. And she had 3 boxes for the 3 Chinese-sized children who'd stand up at the counter and buy something. So she had 3 size boxes for small, medium, and large, like the 3 bears. So she So we had Tante Becky in Chinatown, we had Ita on the east side, and that's my mother's family. My father's family, who knows where they were. Uncle Saul was 3 blocks down on Kingston Avenue, but I heard recently that he was always running around, so his wife and him didn't get along too well, and he was never there. And he had a daughter, Renee, who we went to see in Miami, who lives in Miami today. Renee, I haven't seen her in, oh my God, 20 years. And then my brother had Saul, that was Saul, his brother Saul, and Louis. Uncle Louis, they said I took after Uncle Louis. Uncle Louis never worked. And Uncle Louis lived in Brighton Beach on the boardwalk, in a room where he had so he was cooking on a stove, on a hot plate that he wasn't allowed to, and he was selling tombstones. And Saul was selling tombstones. So Uncle Louis would sit on the boardwalk, talk to old people, and sell them tombstones. I don't know where Louis, what I'm just saying is, it was a convoluted family of tombstone salesmen. Now, my father was a taxi driver. And that was a fine job in those days. We were closer to my mother's family. We lived with them. My aunts loved me. You got to remember, there was Aunt Belle, Aunt Ida, and Aunt Elsie. There was Jack and Joseph. So there were 5 children who were my uncles and aunts. They had no children. They were young. My mother was the oldest, much older. My father was much older than my mother. My father, I think, was 15 or 20 years older than my mother. So my aunts really they just loved us. They took us, my uncles took us ice skating. My aunts took us to Academy of Music, to plays. They took us to the movies. They took us places, me and my sister and my brothers. So we had not only a decent life, but our life was made better by the aunts and uncles, my mother's sisters and brothers, who helped take us and show us the world. So we didn't know. We would go to Manhattan Beach, where only the rich went. It was a private beach with lockers, and my aunts belonged there. And on Sunday, they'd have Rudy Valley singing at the bandstand, and the ladies would go dressed up and go to the cabana lockers and get dressed, and they had big sections for ladies and big sections. Well, I was only 4 or 5 years old. They had to take me in the ladies section. I had to keep my eyes closed for hours. And when they got dressed, then we'd go out to the beach. But they close your eyes, and then you have to go into the lady. They weren't enclosed. The locker was enclosed, but they were like the sun, and you could see the sky. And then when my uncles took me, we went to the men's section, but they didn't say close your eyes for some reason. I don't know why, but they said. So we went to Manhattan Beach, but that was rich people. I think Paul Whiteman or Benny Goodman, the big orchestras. The bandstand at Manhattan Beach was like the Waldorf Astoria. On Sunday, people would come to Manhattan Beach. Manhattan Beach was down from Coney Island. No one probably didn't hear of Coney Island, Tricia, but Coney Island, and was a very bad area way back. Gambling and prostitution, and so they moved down to Brighton Beach, where they put up nice hotels for the well-to-do for the summer, and the Hotel Brighton was there. That was before my time, before I was born, but that became Brighton, more upscale than Coney Island. There were no rides and things like that, no carnival. The next step was Manhattan Beach, which was also called Oriental Beach because there was a hotel called the Oriental. Again, before I was born. So we would go to Manhattan Beach, and they had a swimming pool, and it was quite a life, but my aunts were working. Now, we were already into the Depression, 1932, 33, I was 4 or 5 years old. And the Depression started in 1929, but my aunts were working. my uncles were working. And so they had 5 incomes in the house with my grandmother and grandfather, so they can afford. They went on a cruise to Bermuda during the Depression. They weren't rich, but they certainly weren't poor, and I think they helped my mother. As a matter of fact, we were going to move. Things were very bad. My father was making, well, probably $10 a week, $11 a week, maybe $9 some weeks, $14, and we couldn't afford the rent. And it must have been somewhere along in the Depression. I must have been 10 years old or 12, I don't know. No, I was before that, maybe 10. My mother decided to move to Sterling Place, which was about 4 blocks, 3 blocks this way and 5 blocks away, but it was a poorer neighborhood, and she got a rental for $20. $5 was a lot of money. So the landlord said that they would cut the rent for 3 months to $20, so we'd stay, because tenants were hard to find. And my grandmother, I think, gave her $5 a month. So we stayed, thank heavens. I really didn't want to move. And so we had this childhood. There was a depression going on. It was remember, I was born in 28. I was 7 years old and 35. I was going to Manhattan Beach when I was 7, 5, 4, 6. We would go, my mother would take me to Farragut Pool. That was another private pool, not in the neighborhood, but a little ways away, that charged 25 cents. Very few people would spend 25 cents. We would go to Prospect Park and go rowing. It's a beautiful big park. It was 10 cents for a half hour for a big rowboat. So we did the things that we didn't know we were poor. We didn't know we were. Okay, I don't think we were poor. My father was working. In those days, you can be out of, once the Depression started, my brother could look for a job for 6 months. You couldn't get a job. Robert, at 18, was selling Electrolux vacuum cleaners, trying different jobs. My brother Marvin was very lucky. Before World War II, which started in 1941, he got a job at the Brooklyn Navy Yard as an apprentice machinist. And they taught him to be a machinist, which there was like 2,000 people applied for the job. And they may have hired 20. So we were very happy. But now you got to take this setting. Here we are in a depression, but we're eating. And we're living in an apartment which was the whole size of this living room. The whole apartment was the size of this living room. There was a bedroom, a living room, a dining room, and a kitchen. And my mother and father slept in the dining room, and my sister and I slept in the living room, and my 2 brothers slept in the bedroom. And we ate in the kitchen, because we couldn't sleep in the kitchen because there was no room. Anyway, the kitchen was small. We all couldn't sit down to eat, really. I think we could only eat 4 at a time. And because on one wall there was my sister tried to kill me, but she didn't. No, let me finish. I had a scar up here. When I lived in Williamsburg, I always thought it was Brooklyn. I was climbing on the sink and I was going to go out the window, and my sister pushed me to save my life. And I fell into a garbage can and cut my head on a sardine can, I believe. So I had all my life had a scar over here, and because my hair used to be down to here, you can see it through the hair. So, but I thought it was in Brooklyn, and the other day I realized, my sister said, no, that was in Williamsburg. See, my sister was 21 months older than me. So when I was 2, she was going to be 4, which she had memories of. My brother Marvin was 7 years older than me, and Robert was 9 years older than me. So, we're going to take the phone. Okay, so my brother Robert was 9 years older than me. Right now, I'm 76 in June. He is 85 next month in April. And Robert, we're going to go back ahead and back. Robert was a communist. He hears this, and he would take me, I think he took me, my mother hated it. I mean, he took me to communist meetings. I guess that we were singing communist songs, like, I don't remember them right now, but da 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 da, you know, it was really communist. And in that era, that was the era of where communism was emerging in the world. But anyway, Robert at 19 went to Washington. He got a job working for the government. I think he was 19 or 20, he would be between 19 and 20, doing something for the government in Washington, and they paid him like $19 a week or $20 a week, which was good money, and he moved. So when I was 10, Robert left, which gave Marvin the room. It gave Marvin the room for the bedroom. Now, if we get rid of Marvin, but then my sister would take the bedroom, and I would sleep in the living room. So Marvin stayed until he went to the Army. Now, I'm going to go backwards a while. So my sister moved in. I didn't get that bedroom until my sister got married, which I was already 93 years old when I got the bedroom. So basically, it was a matter of rotation. And, but it was nice. I remember, anyway, we're going to go back. We had a nice life. We saw the show Jumbo, the biggest show in the world, at the New York Hippodrome, because we had a cousin, Elsie Michael, whose husband worked with the show, and she was a radio actress. Elsie, I have pictures of Elsie died recently. Not Aunt Elsie, Cousin Elsie. You see, my father's family was wonderful to us, and there was a reason. They were all stepchildren. His nieces, Elsie and Sue, and the other cousin, they were stepchildren, and they were treated very badly. My father and mother treated them very nicely, especially my father. And they remembered it, that only one person treated them nicely. So as they got a little richer than us, like Elsie was an actress and then her husband had a nice business, she'd come and take us to the beach in her car. We didn't have any car. No one in our family had a car. And she would take us to the beach. And so we had relatives treating us very nicely. And then my Aunt Belle got married when I was about 8 years old. 8. And she got a beautiful apartment on Riverside Drive in a house building with Babe Ruth, the baseball player, and opera singers. They paid $100 a month rent. Well, we were paying $25. You imagine. And they had one bedroom, an office for Uncle Leo, and a living room and a kitchen for $100, but big and modern, doormen, footmen, elevators, the nicest building on Riverside Drive. So at 8 years old, I was able to go to Riverside Drive and spend a week or 2 weeks in the summer with Aunt Belle. And then cousin Vera was born when I was 10 years old. But okay. So all this growing up, I was raised by my mother and father. My sister took wonderful care. My sister was in charge of me. Mother would say, go downstairs. See, mother never worked. Mothers in those days never worked. They never worked. And the reason they never worked was very simple. There was no debt. There was no credit cards. There was no television. There were no telephones. There was no way to spend money other than a movie for a dime or a quarter. So the father, if he had a job, could support. There was no car payments. All they had to do was provide room, food, and a pair of shoes once a year, and sneakers in the summer, and a shirt and a hat for Passover. Got to have a hat for Passover. Every young man wanted a fedora hat with a feather for Passover. I think I was 2 years old and had a hat with a feather for Passover. I didn't know what Passover was. I thought it was a hat holiday. Anyway, so basically, we grew up in an era where the family was all around. Grandma moved out of that building, she moved to President Street, then she moved to Carroll Street with an elevator, but they were there. So we grew up in, I can't outline everything we did, but we went to movies, the Academy of Music, we went to shows. My brother took me to see Porgy and Bess, a very big Broadway show. I didn't like it, I still don't like shows. Maybe I don't like it now because I didn't like Porgy and Bess. And we sat in the bad seat. And they took me to the circus, and he got a ticket in the last row, the last balcony behind the post. And he had to pay, I think, 25 cents to the usher so we could sit on the steps and see the circus. I felt very badly for him because he worked hard for his money. And here we were in the last row, the last balcony behind the post, which was a great circus we saw. That's why I don't like circuses, I guess. So, but all this was going on, and while this was going on, the world was getting ready for a war. In England, they were digging foxholes in 1938, 39. They were digging trenches in the street. We weren't involved, but where my grandmother moved out, Mrs. Corrin moved in. See, Mrs. Corrin was an English lady who went back to England to visit, and she came back and was telling my mother in 1938 that they're putting guns in the street, anti-aircraft guns, and they're putting sandbags. They were waiting for Hitler to come and invade and bomb them. Next door was Mrs. Nussenbaum. Mrs. Nussenbaum's husband was a baker, I think. Mrs. Corrin, I don't know if she had a husband. She had a son in jail. He was a postman, and he stole the mail, or I don't know what he did. He threw him in the garbage, and they arrested him. But they let him out when the war started to go fight in the war, and he did very well. So some guy was killed, and the father put him in, whatever, not his father, the guy. But anyway, so Mrs. Corrin, and you got to remember, there was no first names in those days. I don't know if Mrs. Corrin even had a first name. My mother was, of course, Mrs. Rosenzweig, Mrs. Nussenbaum, Mr. Nussenbaum. There was no first name. You didn't, even if you were, my mother wouldn't say, she'd say, Mrs. Corrin, and the windows would face each other in the courtyard. And so, okay, so we were raised in a Jewish neighborhood. There were only Jewish people on the block. You got to remember, there was a lot of houses. Every house had 16 families in it, pretty much along our street. And there were 4 floors, 4 families to a floor, that was the pattern. And there was a courtyard in between. Every 2 houses had a joint courtyard. So Tante Becky was in my courtyard, but maybe the Ruckels were in the other one courtyard for the next building. Anyway, so we'd go down and play, and my sister would always take care of me. And my mother would say, you know, go down and play. We'd play on the stoop. What's a stoop? A stoop in Brooklyn is the front of your house that has not indoors, not outdoors. It's stoop. It's like a concrete pad attached to the front door where you would play. It was probably 10 feet wide, 8 feet deep, and you'd play on the stoop. I don't know why, maybe because you were stupid you played on the stoop. I don't know, but it was a stoop. And you played ball on the stoop and everything. The kids played jacks on the stoop. There was a concrete thing. Okay. And there was hallways. And so anyway, we're getting now to, well, where am I? I'm going to school across the street, Public School 167, Eastern Parkway in Schenectady. Now, where are we living? 2 or 3 blocks to the right, 4 blocks, is Lincoln Terrace Park, which is a park with handball, grass, maybe a nice-sized park. 10 blocks the other way is Prospect Park, Grand Army Plaza, the Brooklyn Museum, Botanical Gardens. So on Sunday, you pretty much had to walk because your parents didn't want to spend the money. You walked a couple of miles, and you went Botanical Gardens. And it was beautiful with Japanese ponds and flowers. But then you go to Coney Island sometimes and you go swimming and there's sand all over you and the plums with sand on it. That's why I hate the beach. If I hate everything in life, it's because I had to do these things as a child. In those days when you were on the beach in Coney Island, there wasn't 2 inches between you and your neighbor. Because everyone was poor, the beach was free, and the houses were hot, there was no air conditioning, so you want to go in the ocean. So you'd go to Coney Island, and I'm telling you, you'd lay out your blanket, and the next one would come along and lay out their blanket 1 inch away. And you didn't have money to buy sandwiches, so they'd bring sandwiches, and by the time you ate it, it was hot, and the fruit was hot. Mommy, I want ice cream! And of course, maybe there was a nickel and you had ice cream. So what they thought they were doing me this wonderful thing, taking me to the beach, and I guess it was wonderful. I hate the beach because I don't like sand. So anyway, but now we're up to, my school is there, the parks are there, Eastern Parkway has trees, and it's beautiful. But now the best thing in the world comes along. 1939. What a wonderful year. See, at the top of our school newspaper, at the top of our elementary school, you used to have to write your name, every paper, and the date and the year. So it was June 25th, 1938. Then next year was 39. What was 1939? The New York World's Fair. What a wonderful situation. Right there, from my music window on the 4th floor of Public School 167, I could see the Trilon and Perisphere, or the Trilon, on a clear day. And believe it or not, from the roof of my house, and by the way, we used to sleep on the fire escape because it was so hot in the house. We would sleep on the fire escape and sleep on the roof because we needed a breeze. But now the World's Fair was coming. And this was like, you couldn't believe it. This was the most exciting thing. It was 10 times better than Disney. It was bigger than Disney. It had 100 buildings, and it was the world of the future. And the things that we live with today, they showed us then. The highways, the cars. They showed television for the first time in 1939 to the public. But let me go back. My Uncle Mac, who was a radio man, he built his own television set in 1937. And in 1937, there was no programs. They were only test programs. So on Sunday night, we'd go over to his house, and we would watch some stupid opera or a hockey game on a screen this big in black and white, and it was television. And in those days, when they did a scene of people driving in the car, they would take 4 chairs, and they'd go like this. But that Uncle Mac was a genius because he built his own television before RCA showed it at the fair. So we had this fair, which I went to 11 times. 11 times. My aunt took me, my school took me, my mother took me. It was 25 cents, I think, for children to go to the World's Fair and the bus ride. The bus stopped right in front of my house. You can go by train to Queens, which we did, there was a nickel, or there was a bus that stopped and then went right to the fair. And my Uncle Leo took me. And my Uncle Leo took me to a mental institution, but I refused to stay. My Uncle Leo was a psychiatrist, and he didn't like to take the ride to the Pilgrim State Hospital on Long Island to see patients, so he'd ask me to drive with him. And Uncle Leo was very strange. He was a Russian, and he spoke English, and he was very nice, but he always used to ask me the same question when I was 10 years old and 11 years old. What do you think of the world situation? I didn't know there was a world out there. What do you think of the world? And then he would listen. I would want to listen to Eddie Cantor. He would listen to the news. I stayed at his house for 8 days, 10 days. News, news, news. And I didn't really care about news when I was 10 years old and 11. So anyway, 1939, I was 11 years old. And he took me out to the World's Fair. And that's where the Unger story comes in. With a man, I know was 39, he said, you can't come into the building. He was doing a case study of a malingerer, some guy who was claiming he was ill and was getting money from the state. Anyway, they called him in from New Jersey. a man called me over to the window, was netting, and he said, "My name is Mr. Unger. I don't belong here. Go call my brother. Here's the phone number." Then I took his phone number in the paper. I took his phone number on the paper, and I went to the movie. I think Dodge City was playing, and all the inmates were in the big movie theater because there was thousands of people there. It was a big hospital, big. They closed it. Anyway, my uncle comes out, and he says, and I show him the note, he said, "Throw it away because they all don't belong here." To make a long story short, it was about 40 years later, they opened the Swan Hotel in Disney. And the girl who took me on a tour of the rooms, her name was Unger. So I said to myself, well, maybe that's Unger's granddaughter. So I gave her dinner on me. I gave her a slip to have dinner at Disney. I knew she wasn't, but I wanted to be nice to Mr. Unger. So this girl's name was Unger. And so if she had dinner with her boyfriend or husband on me, so I felt better that I let Mr. Unger stay in the mental institution for 40 years, Mr. Unger. But I remember his name. I was 11 years old. Oh, after that, we went to the World's Fair. We met my aunts and uncles, but would go dress up. We couldn't afford the rich people were pushed around on carts and, well, they didn't have motors. They had motors, but men would push them, and they would eat in restaurants. I have a menu right back there of the World's Fair. The menu, dinner was 35 cents, 40 cents. But anyway, so we had this wonderful life. The World's Fair was 1939 and 1940. And then when I was a young kid, President Roosevelt came down Eastern Parkway and we all waved. I have a copy of a model of a car, 1938, that he was driving in over there. So I had all these wonderful experiences of a nice school in a nice neighborhood, the World's Fair, a Farragut pool, Betsy Head pool, Manhattan Beach. It was a wonderful life. And now, all of a sudden, the world is at war. My brother Marvin goes off to war. My brother Robert goes off to war. My sister goes to work at jobs. That's a very important factor which I bypassed. Because we went to work at about 12 years old. Well, first of all, you worked for pennies when you may be 10 or 11. See, no one had phones to speak of. Phones were $1.85 a month to have a phone. Well, we didn't have a phone until my sister started to date. My mother said, we'll get a phone so a guy could call her, marry her when she was 3 years old. Anyway, so we didn't have a phone, and we got a call at my grandmother's house. But the candy stores and the drugstores had batteries of wooden phone booths with doors, and 5 phone booths. So if somebody called the store, they would say, "Get me Mrs. Nussenbaum at 1004 Eastern Parkway." So you would hold the phone, let it lay there, run and go to Mrs. Nussenbaum, tell her there's a phone call, and maybe you get a penny or 2 cents. All right, so you were a phone runner, like a bookmaker. And then you had the cleaning stores next door. Like he would say, "Take this garment to Mr. Fish." So maybe you get a nickel, a penny, or 2 cents. So you carried a garment. And then the grocer would say, "Can you take this?" So you hung around the street. At 12 years old, I went to work really for Joe's Luncheonette. Soda jerk, sandwich maker, egg maker. And that was my career. I spent a lot of years there. But I also delivered meat. The Jewish people ordered meat from a Jewish butcher, Mr. Geller, around the corner. See, we had Mr. Hoffman's Grocery. There was no supermarkets. Hoffman's Grocery, Mr. Geller's Butcher. The grocery store man was who knows what. The shoe man was Italian. Every shoemaker in New York was Italian. The barber was Italian. The rest of the world was Jewish. Okay? But that's the way life was in Brooklyn. Now, so we would deliver. Friday morning, we would take a bicycle with a big basket and deliver meat, hoping you'd get a nickel tip, I think. But 10 blocks away at Turner Towers, which was a couple of miles, you used to get a quarter if the lady was home. If the maid, that was the only major building near Grand Army Plaza. So if the maid was there, maybe you didn't get anything. You drove 2 miles on a bicycle and you got nothing. So you went to school must have been 14 when I was doing that, because I'd go to high school in the afternoon. We had split session. In the morning, I'd deliver meat, work it, and at night we'd work. I would get 12 cents an hour working at Joe's. So if you worked 4 hours, you made 48 cents, and you got some tips. But that was the life, and you were happy to have it. And I think I told you once before, the only maybe 20 kids worked at Joe's rotating in life. He was the candy store hangout. Only one was able to wear their apron out. I told you that story. That aprons had pockets, and the money was kept in the pocket. Joe, his father, his brother Eddie, his wife Erminie had money. You had to turn it inside out so you didn't steal his money, because you'd go out to the newspaper stand, the soda, and I was the only one ever worked there that was able to keep the money in the pocket. And I was able to go out for a break for 10, 15 minutes with the money, and he knew he was safe, which was a very nice thing. And what started me on being honest was Mrs. Stitt. Mrs. Stitt, in first or second grade, she said, "You're not getting a star because you talked." And at the end of the day, they give stars out. So she gave me a star. I said, "Mrs. Stitt, you told me I wasn't going to get a star because I was talking." And she said, "You're going to get 2 stars for being honest." So I got 2 honest, and Mrs. Stitt taught me how stupid I was to get 2 stupid stars. No. It was a good lesson in honesty. So we went through the Joes, the working, and when I said I had 42 jobs, I can't outline all the jobs, because you worked for a butcher, you worked for the cleaning store, you worked for Joe's, and then when you were 16 or 15, well, the war broke out in 1941 in this country. 1941, I was 13 years old. 13 years old. All the men were going to the service. The ladies were going into the factories. The jobs were all over the place. So at 15, I went to Asbury Park to become a busboy. Asbury Park, New Jersey. They ran me out of town with the cops. Me and Beezy and Larry. We wanted to go with girls on the boardwalk at night. They wanted us to serve Passover dinner at sundown, and we stupid kids said, "No, we want to serve it early so we can go to the boardwalk." And they called the cops to get them out of here. And they took us to the station. We went home. So we worked 1 meal, Passover. The next night we weren't going to work. We were striking. 15, you see. But then from there I worked in Abraham and Strauss in the dress department, in the drapery department. You can go in and get a job if you can breathe, because that was it. So I worked as in a movie. I worked in, at 14 I had a full-time job with Monroe Markowitz. Uncle Jack had a friend. He always needed a shave, but he didn't need a shave every day, but he was, like Nixon, had a lot of dark hair. Monroe had a textile business, theatrical textiles, right in Times Square. 1942, summer. I worked in Times Square. I can show you pictures. 6th floor, I would look down and count sailors' white outfits. And Monroe Markowitz said at the end of the summer to Uncle Jack, "This is the laziest human being I've ever seen in my life." Me. Okay? He said, he would sit there by the window. See, I was a delivery boy. I got 50 cents an hour. 40 hours, $20. And that was the minimum wage, 50 cents an hour. And some guy would come up every day and punch me in the arm, a trucker from Empire Truckers, big guy. He was a bully, and he would punch me. I got to go to work every day being punched. But you see, so I worked for Monroe. I had to deliver. And I delivered, when I delivered, I would see what was going on in the different places. Paper mate. I would deliver to, okay, the battery's running dead, I'm not. And we're going to call it a day, and we'll continue tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and we'll remember where we left off at probably the war starting, and I'm taking jobs all over the country, and I'll go into it tomorrow. Thank you. Okay, today's the next day. Now, what is the next day? Let's see, the next day is the day after Grandma's birthday, which would be March the 18th, the year 2004. I'm 75 years old, and people don't know what this is. You know, we started out, and people looking at this 50 years from now will say, who's the old man talking and why? Well, so let me explain. I should explain this at the beginning, that this is a biography of my life. Tricia had this plan to do a thing for school, and it was, or for business, or whatever it is, that would take her grandfather and take him from his earliest memories at 2 years old to 75. And the rich and the famous write biographies, and the poor and me do a video, because we don't know how to write. And you can envision that it's 50 years from now, and this little child is saying to her mother, who's the old man in the picture? And her mother will say, that's Grandma Tricia's grandfather. Oh, yeah. Grandma Tricia's grandfather? Yes. I didn't know him. So basically, 50 years is not a long time. And 50 years from now, Tricia's going to be 68 years old with her own grandchildren. So this is basically my life as it intertwines with the family, the world, and whatever it is. So let me continue where we left off yesterday. Yesterday we left off, I think, where my sister was taking care of me a lot. You can whisper. Jobs?
You're
Yeah, we're talking about different jobs and why I had 42 jobs. And I had 42 jobs because the war was on and everyone was in war plants, and 10 million American boys and ladies were in the army, and millions were making battleships and guns. So young children were able to go to work. So if I changed my job every month or 2 months or 3 months, it really didn't make much difference, and I got a lot of experience and a lot of changing of jobs. So I worked after school in we'll go to school, high school in a moment, but let's go back to 1939 when I was 11 years old, and I was talking about the World's Fair and public school, and it was a nice public school, and Tricia's getting up, and she wants to see if there's any time left. Is it running? Now, I'm not going to explain all 42 jobs because it would get kind of strange. I worked at the Laurels Country Club, and the work experiences were very important in my life. I went for Passover to work as a bellhop at the Laurel Country Club at Sackett Lake in Sullivan County, where I was 16. I had been working at Abraham and Strauss in the dress department, and it was boring. I used to have to pin tickets on dresses. In those days, they didn't come from China with tickets on them. The tickets had to be put on in the store. And you used to hang the dresses and rehang them. And I worked in the drapery department, and used to hang drapes and measure out fabric. And I worked at so many jobs that gave me the experience of all these industries. And this is when I was 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, part-time when I was in high school. I worked for a glove company. It was, I guess, right after the war, because it had to be 1945. And this guy was an importer of gloves, an elderly man and his wife. And it was just the two of them, and I was like a packing clerk. And they used to watch me when I left the place every night that I wasn't stealing gloves. They didn't search me, but they sort of watched my hands, and they, is he stealing gloves? And then Christmas came, and they gave me a big bonus, a carton of cigarettes. I guess that's how I started to smoke. No, I don't know. But that was the days, my friend, I thought they'd never end. It was a musical score. Yeah. But, so all these jobs got me to meet bosses and know what a boss was about, what I liked in bosses, what I didn't like in bosses. I wanted to be trusted, like Joe trusted me with his money. And this guy was watching me that I wasn't stealing his gloves. If I stole a pair of gloves a day, I have 900 pair of gloves somewhere hidden. And, and then I went to work in a big central office where they had lots of stores, and I used to pin on a machine stocking, a hosiery, men's hosiery. Pip, 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 pip. And it would stick the pin and the ticket on, and if you missed it, it went through your finger, and you were on sale for $14.95 a dozen. So these are the experiences of equipment, and this was all before and while I was in high school. And while we're going back to the war now, so let's go back to 14. 1941, President Roosevelt was president. He was elected in 1932. He took office in January 1933, and he was up president for 4 terms. Back in those days, a president could run as many times as he wanted, and it was because he ran 4 terms, got elected, they decided to change the law and only make it 2 terms for a president. So he was a president from the time I was 4 years old, 5 years old, till he died before the war ended, and his vice president, Mr. Truman, took over. But during the war, young kids were doing things, and people were doing things. We were collecting scrap. I was a Boy Scout, and we were air raid warden for a while. The night of Pearl Harbor, when I was in the movie, by the way, Tricia, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, and I came home from the movie, and there was no television. And the radio said, of course, and I think Franklin Roosevelt was on that night or the next day, and you know, the old speech, this date will live in infamy, etc., etc. And so here I was, 1941, 13 years old, and we were at war. And I ran out and went to the air raid wardens and wanted to volunteer. They said, go to that corner over there 6 blocks away and look up for airplanes. I was 13 years old. So I stood there in that corner, looked up for airplanes, enemy bombers, for 3, 4, 5 hours, and no one relieved me. And I said, I think I should go home, because it was already like midnight. And of course, I found out the next day that you couldn't be an air raid warden at 13 years old. And I was just looking up at planes that never matured. And we had these floodlights in the sky, and they had anti-aircraft guns in Prospect Park. Imagine, right by your house, you had soldiers in foxholes in the parks with anti-aircraft guns. It was a weird feeling. And so you go through this war, men are going off to war, and men are dying. And you have a thing called Gold Star mothers. If your son or daughter goes off to war, in those days it was mostly men, and you lived where your window could be seen pretty much, you hung a satin pennant in the window, about 8 inches by 10 inches, with a blue star on it for every child that went. So if you had 2 children, you held 2 stars. And if one died, you bought a gold star. And they were called Gold Star mothers. And there were 1 million Gold Star mothers in America by the time the war ended. We had 10 million people in service. So all this is going on, and it starts when I'm 13 years old, 1941. And we're going to now phase into another tape, so the director says, wrap it up.
You know, I'm gonna get something on me.
Yeah, I'm going to get a glass of water, meanwhile, for me. This is a continuation tape 2. We left off on the last tape 10 minutes ago. We were talking about the wartime. Now, let's put it in perspective. War started when I was 13, and I had a teacher in elementary school, Mr. Allen, who said, "You boys in this class will be in the Army." And we looked at him like he was crazy. We're 13 years old. What are we going to do in the Army? And sure enough, he was right. I was in the Army, but it was later on. And the war went on when we were 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. And they didn't draft you until you were 18. So the war ended, they stopped the draft, and we did not go at that time. We were drafted again, which is later on in the program, a different channel. What did we do during the war? When I went to school, I worked at the Brooklyn Port of Embarkation at night, filing. It was down at the docks where the soldiers would leave the country. In fact, I left for Germany from that port in 1951. But I worked there as a file clerk. And I got into a fight at night, and a fist fight with some, won't mention who or why or what, because it would be inflammatory. And so I sort of called it quits, because at midnight down at the docks, it wasn't the most pleasant neighborhoods. And I think we had our fight in front of a bar. It was a stupid fight. I think I lost. I don't know. But it wasn't, I should tell the story, but I won't. I should. What happened was, we would filing clerks at night, and there was a very beautiful Irish girl, and there was a not so beautiful, fat, crazy, ugly Jewish girl. And the Irish girl said to me, "Who's the prettiest in the room?" And I said, "Her, the other one." Well, she got all excited, and then the Irish guy in the room, there were 2 or 3 of them, waited outside for me and wanted to know why I insulted the Irish girl, and we got into a fight. Of course, there was no question. Why she even wanted an answer was beyond me. But I guess that was the way it was. They saw too many passion plays. So that was the port of embarkation. And as I said, I worked at the Laurels. I worked at a lot of jobs. I worked at Howard's Clothes, men's clothing. But everything taught me something. All those experiences led to me going into business and staying in business for 44 years up till now, and we're still in business. But every experience, because all you are the sum of your experiences. That's what you are. Experiences lead to one good life, good experiences, bad experience. If you learn to live with experiences and accumulate them and digest them and handle them properly, you live your life. So all these experiences, Howard Clothes. Why did I leave Howard Clothes? Well, it was Halloween, and it was during the war, and I was the party maker of our club, and we were making a Halloween party, and I wanted balloons. Well, there were no balloons because balloons were made out of rubber. Latex wasn't invented yet, and the rubber was going to the war. So I said, if I go down a Canal Street to the wholesale section, I'll find balloons. So I said to my boss, I'm going down to buy balloons. He says, "You're working." I said, "I don't work here anymore. I'm in the balloon business." I walked out, never went back, because I knew the next day I could have a job at Ripley Clothes. But what did I learn at Howard Clothes? It's a men's clothing store. What did I learn? I learned very simply. I was the little boy, let's say I was 16 years old, and someone would come in and have a low-price suit, pants. Someone would come in and say, "I took the suit home and the jacket don't fit well over here." So the salesman or the tailor would go, mark it up, chalk, 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 and they would say to me, "David, take this to our best tailor, Mr. Hoffman, and Mr. Hoffman will do a job for you that you'll never believe." Well, Mr. Hoffman wasn't a tailor. Mr. Hoffman was a pressing machine. Every pressing machine in the nation then and now was made by Hoffman. And we pressed out the chalk. If you steam a jacket and take out the chalk, that's Mr. Hoffman. So I learned in life that there are honest business people and dishonest people, and you've got to weed them out and be honest. You see? So part of the dishonesty and honesty was ingrained in life in general. By watching how honest people worked and how dishonest people worked. Mr. Hoffman, I think if you go into a store today, a clothing store, and look at the pressing machine, you would end up with the name Hoffman on it. Probably made a lot of money on a lot of machines. Okay, so all these jobs, I was a delivery boy. But when I delivered, I'd go through the building and I'd see Papermate, a little business. Papermate was just starting. It was a sign on a door. I would deliver sprinkles, spangles that girls put on their eyes to greeting card companies. But I just didn't deliver it. I'd go through the greeting card companies. They're small businesses in those days. What they would do is they'd put glue on the card, sprinkle it, and that was a glitter card. But what I'm saying is, between delivery and the 42 jobs, I saw hundreds of businesses, and all those experiences worked. Okay, so we're now in the war, and I'm in high school. Now, why am I doing so poorly in school? I wasn't a genius in elementary school, but my IQ was good. We just took an IQ test now, it was 126, and in elementary school, my IQ was 122, which should have put me into a decent category of education. I think today, looking back, I had ADH, which was an illness that no one even ever heard of back then. It wasn't even diagnosed back then. But there had to be a reason why I could not grasp. And what we had back in those days, we had classes that structured you mentally. If you were in, let's say, 2A1 meant that you were in the best and smartest class. 2A3 meant you were in the next smartest class. 2A4 meant you weren't too bright, but you weren't too stupid. That's where I was. The 5 classes were not too bright. Morty Pollack was in 5. He was not always that swift. The 2 class, they were the dummies. Now, why was the 2, the dummies, and the 5? Very simple. We surmise that when they first started the schools, there were only 2 classes, the 1s and the 2s, the smarts and the dopes. As the school system grew, rather than taking the 2 stupids and making them 3s and then 4s and 5s, they kept the 2s and threw in 3, 4, and 5. So what happened was, I think I was in the 3 class once in the 8 years. I was in the 4 class all the time. I was never in a 2. But I really wasn't the best student. I was good at art. And that's how I ended up maybe in this business. I was good in art. I used to like to draw football players. Great. I was very bad in sports. Now listen to this very carefully. When they chose up a baseball team, if they needed an extra player, I got elected at the end of the team. But I really wasn't good in sports. Maybe because of my eyes, maybe because of my brain, I don't know. I just wasn't into sports. What I enjoyed was, and it also carries into the business and life today with all the miniature things. I would go to the museum called the Brooklyn Museum, I think, where they had miniature displays. I'd go to the military museum where they had battlefields and military, and that's when I used to make train sets now. I wasn't a museum person for paintings, but I loved the dioramas and the miniatures. And I spent time going to convention halls, looking at guns. Now, don't get me wrong, because during the war they had military displays on Lexington Avenue. So my focus was on things rather than physical sports. As a matter of fact, when I was a Boy Scout, I only got one merit badge. See, Boy Scouts go for merit badges. And I only got one merit badge, and that was for observation. And what the observation test was very interesting. Back in those days, store windows had 100 different items in it. A hardware store would have 60, 70 items. Store windows weren't a mannequin. They were a big part of walking down the street, and store windows were 20% of the space was windows. And so they would put you in front of a very complex window and say, for 3 minutes you're going to look at the window, and then we're going to test you on what you saw. So I got a merit badge for observing and remembering what was in the window. So basically I had, I couldn't tie a knot. I don't think I could rescue any other boy swimming, but I was great at observation. So if a kid was drowning, I'd say, hey, he's drowning. That was observation. You see, you had to be smart, okay? The building's on fire. You didn't go in and put it out, but you pointed. The building's on fire. Observation. So anyway, that was my life as a young person. I built model planes, which I built model trains as I grew older. So all those years, and you will look back, Tricia, and say, they were formative years for you, and they should be. But those are the formative years. And by doing so much, I was forming a curator mentality. I was storing information. Now here I was, the war ended, I was 17, I already had 20 jobs, 30 jobs, I had already been to school, I'd been in high school, which I'll get to in a moment, and I haven't even gotten into the social life yet of life, and I was 17 years old. And I had been curating the world unknowingly with all these experiences in what we called in those days our computer, which was our brain. We didn't know what computers were, but we were storing information for some kind of future. So maybe it was good that I wasn't into sports. Maybe it was good that I didn't like to watch football games and baseball games. But maybe my curator mind took on different things that later on in life made life easier and more, we'll say, profitable or interesting as I grew into an adult. So here I was, not too bright. And by the way, we'll go into this later, but when I went into the Army, I was in the 99 percentile of all the people who went into the Army, which was my downfall. But, so my brain was there, it just wasn't functioning in the school level for some reason. So now I go on to high school. And of course they give us our choices, because we lived in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, which was a very beautiful section. We could go to Erasmus, which was an upscale school in Flatbush, or we can go to Tilden. Well, I elected to go to Samuel J. Tilden because my brother went there. The other friends, Larry and I think Beasy and all Stewie, they all went to Erasmus. Morty and I, Morty was 1 year ahead of me. He went to Tilden, I went to Tilden. And Stanley Clark went to Tilden. So there were only 3 of us from the streets went to Tilden, and 8 or so went to Erasmus. And high school, well, I did as well in high school as I did in elementary school. I really did well. I took Spanish for 3 years and got out of Spanish 1. Maybe.
Just like your grandson.
You grandson. And I got to geometry, and I think when I got to, I didn't get to calculus, and I didn't get to trigonometry. I thought trigonometry was what was on a gun, trigonometry, but I didn't know all those things. But and by the way, we had a great teacher in school, Sam Levinson. And I'm going to get to this concept later. Sam Levinson was a civics teacher. He wasn't mine, he was Morty's teacher. Sam Levinson was the biggest comic of the times. Sam Levinson was big. Sam Levinson was on radio shows. He got on television shows. He was on the Ed Sullivan Show many times. And eventually he gave up being a teacher. He lived on where we lived about 3 blocks away. But who was the guy we saw the other day at the show, the comic, the Jewish comic, whatever it was? Sam Levinson was a home. He spoke about his mother, his brothers. He was funny and wrote many books, but he was our teacher in Tilden. Anyway, so I got to my senior year in Tilden, and I knew I wasn't going to graduate. It was May of 1946, and June was graduation. And I had a friend in school by the name of Seymour Boyers, B-O-Y-E-R-S, who ended up being the state representative from Long Island later on in life. And Seymour lived where I live, but Seymour was a veteran of the United States Army. When the war ended, those soldiers who didn't have high school education went back to high school. So he may have been 3 years older or 2 years older than me, but he was in my class. And it was one day, I think it was civics or something, the teacher said, "Boyer, Rosenzweig, stay a while." And he said, "You know, you two guys, veterans of the Army, you two guys, veterans of the Army, you're acting like kids. You're always joking around." So I felt very badly because he was very nice to me, this teacher, all year. But he was nice because he thought I was a veteran of the Army. I guess by my association with Boyer, he figured the two of us were buddies and we were both veterans. So I went home to my mother and I said, "Mom, I'm not going to graduate. I feel bad. I'm not going back." And she says, "Go back." And I said, "No, I'm going to be 18 in June. I think I got as much education, but there's more to it than this." And I left school 1 month in advance, and I knew I didn't have enough credits to graduate. I think you needed 60 credits, and I had 1. I don't know what you needed. I failed 2 subjects, and I would have had to go another term. Anyway, but my education wasn't over. I went on to school and college, to other things after the Army. But what I'm saying is, and it's very important for your grandchildren to hear this, work, 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 and work ethics. I get very angry now when I see the kids at Publix goofing off, and I yell at them, and I yell at everyone who doesn't work, and I yell at them at the mall, and I don't go anywhere anymore because these kids don't work. They hide behind cars when they go out and get the carts. They don't look to work, they look to hide. And I was probably the same way. When I would work and I had to go to the post office, I would sort of go through Macy's and somehow for an hour go through Macy's and then end up in the post office because the post office was the other side of Macy's. Never thought of walking in the street. But the point is this: experiences. So let's go through the war. We finished it. I had all these jobs and the reasons I had the jobs. But what did I do for life? I went to school and worked? No. There had to be in our life a social life. And the social life was different than today. You got to picture Brooklyn, nice street, apartment houses, 16 families, 10 houses down. There'll be 160 families behind you, another 160 families on the street behind you. Across the way, 80 families. Well, what did you do? You didn't have big, luxurious homes, air-conditioned. To entertain, you entertained on the street. You hung out. You had a park with benches right in front of your house. Well, you sat on the benches, and 2 would come, and 6, and 8, and 12, and sometimes it'd be 15. You go down to the corner to Joe's, and there'd be 20 on the corner. And it ended up that on our corner we had about 22 guys from the neighborhood. And there must have been 10 girls. And probably if you saw Grease, da-da-da-da-da-da, they had these, that's what life was about. And you dated young. think I was 5 years old. No, I think you dated at 14, you went to the movies, 15. By 16 already you were going to a movie and maybe a dinner, 17. You dated a lot. Wednesday night was date night. Friday night maybe was roller skating, and you would go to the roller skating rink and meet people. Saturday night you would date, and if you had no date, you'd go to a dance hall. When you were a little older, 17, 18, they had dances all over. At the Jewish Center, at the synagogues, you had dances Saturday night. Sunday I met your grandma, Mrs. Betty Ross. I met her on a Sunday night. But that's later on in life, after the Army. We'll get to all of that. But you dated either individually, two couples. You pretty much took the subway. In this age, no one can drive. New York City driving started at 18. So at 16 and 17, you took the subway or a bus, and you went to a movie, and you went for a Chinese dinner or a sandwich, and that was it. And sometimes it was two couples, or you'd hang around the corner and say, you see, I told you had phone booths, and you'd call up. There was a movie made called Marty. Someday you'll see it. It's a classic about older folk, not our age at that, but 27, 30, who hung around the corner. What are we going to do tonight, Marty? Why don't we call up the girl we met at the dance the other night? Nah, she was a dog, you know. And that was what it was about. So we went through high school. We had a crowd of girls in Far Rockaway. So we'd go out to Far Rockaway, and we would just party. I danced in those days, very little, but I danced. And it was Glenn Miller and Frank Sinatra and Bing Crosby. And then we had another crowd on the beach in Rockaway, where and then we had a crowd here on air. So basically, believe it or not, 16, 17, 18, there was a social life and I can't name all the people I went out with. Mother knows most of their names. Doris Dobshinsky. How do you like that one? That's what I keep reminding Grandma about. Doris Dobshinsky. I think I was 14 and she was 13 and a half. But it was, I don't know about today, and I don't know about, but different world. Everything's different. We have cars today, and it's a different world. So here we were. We went through a war. And when we went to Rockaway, which we went to Rockaway a lot because Larry Cohn had an aunt who lived there, and he stayed there for the summer, and sometimes I'd sleep in his house. Sometimes his father would be a real jerko and say, you got to sleep on the patio. They were real nasty people. His mother was nice. Or I'd sleep on the beach. And, but let me finish. I don't know where I was, but we would go out to the Army and the war. See, what I want to mention, what was going on, blackouts. You couldn't have lights in your house. They always said that an airplane could see a match being lit from 10 miles away. So when it came night, you had a blackout to see. There were no lights on Times Square. The street lights had black on top of them so they shine up. Your windows had to have black shades, so when you turned the lights on in your house, you couldn't have light. The stores on the boardwalk all had black cloth, so when you went in, you had to go in and push the cloth, so submarines could not see you. And then they had Army men or Navy men walking up and down the beach with guns to protect us from invading submarine and spies and so on. And we had blackouts, and we had air raid alerts and horns and whistles, and so we had a normal life, a social life, a school life, a working life, and a war going on. And we were watching for submarines on Eastern Parkway, we were at the beach. So all of these experiences, and your brother, my brother, was on a boat in the Solomon Islands in the Pacific. My mother didn't know if he was alive or dead every day, because they were dying and dying. And it took 2 weeks to get a letter, so by the time you got the letter, you didn't know if he died 13 days ago. And the mothers lived with this, onward, 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 for years, of are they alive or dead? And when you know 1 million people died, American soldiers, it wasn't a matter of, and they would advise you by telegram. So you got all of this going on. People advising, stars in the window, President Roosevelt, blackouts, soldiers on the beach, anti-aircraft guns in Prospect Park, dating Doris Dobzhinsky, going to school and working. Now, that's how you end up being what you are at 75 years old. If I didn't experience that, I wouldn't be me. And that's what it's about. So we're giving you the experiences not to hear myself talk, which I love. It is a matter of I am the sum of the world in my days, 75 years, and all those experiences for 75 years. It either makes you dumb, it makes you stupider, it makes you fail, it makes you succeed. It's how you digest it, use it, and environment it into your life. Now, let's also remember for your granddaughter who's watching this, when I was a child, we didn't have a telephone. Now, right now, you'll know from 50 years from now, you people will have telephones in your nails. Hello? You know? There was no cell phones. We had no telephone in the house. My grandmother had a telephone, we didn't. Television did not get released to the public until 1946, because they closed all the channels for the war. So I was 18, really, when television really came into the public, and black and white and horrible. Radio, we didn't have a radio when I was a child, because it was expensive. It was $11, a big cabinet and wood, and my Uncle Mac got it but my mother couldn't tell my father she spent $11. She said she got it for $5. She bought a chair for $7, and she said it cost her $2. Who knows? But here we were. Toasters weren't pop-up. You opened both sides, you put a piece of toast in and you closed it, and you plugged it in and toasted, and then you turned over the toast. So there was nothing. I'm going to this way for a reason. My life transcended a great electronic age. From living with no phone, no television, no radio. And by the way, radio in those days, you had to put up an antenna on the roof the length of the wave. The wave they sent out from the station could have been 100 feet long, so you had to run around the roof on poles 100 feet of wire. Now they wrap it around inside the set. If it's AM and FM, is an antenna like that. But you see, you had to run a wire from your house up on the roof, and the roof had all these wires from 16 people living in the house running around the roof, and all the wires going up the outside of the house. Okay. So the reason we're going into this thing is to not only understand my life and my experiences and the world, what we went through, but the technological changes. Before me came the Industrial Revolution. That was something that came with the steamboat, with the power, with electricity, with machinery. And then, somewhere when I was a teenager and the war ended, we came into the technology world. And that's what we've gone through, which changed our world, like the industrial world was changed by the Industrial Revolution. Now, so to understand where we are today and how we got here, you have to understand that anyone who's 75 years old today, going to be 76 in June, and this is March, and Grandma was 75 yesterday, has gone through video cameras. Well, a video camera, when it came out, you had to pull a 20-pound battery on a wheel behind you. People would walk through Disney with a camera 4 times bigger than this and a cart. And a battery was, like a car battery. And then the first cell phones that came out. The first cell phones that came out were 20 times larger than this, big battery packs over the shoulder. So the things that we do today where everyone walks around with a cell phone, and then 50 years from now, your granddaughter's going to say, cell phone, what's a cell phone? Those are the things they were using back in 2005. But what they use them for? To call people. Well, didn't they have the nail phone? Or what I'm saying is that whatever you're going to be at 75 is part of the world revolution, whatever it's going to be. Maybe, unfortunately, it's going to be an Islamic revolution or a political revolution, not a technical. Maybe it'll be a medical revolution where you'll say, well, I'm only 172. They say lifespan is 250. So your whole world changes because it's not a race with the clock of 75 or back in the old days, people lived to 35 and 40. Romeo and Juliet were 14 and 12, I think, in the book.
They committed suicide.
What?
They committed suicide.
Yes, but they were children because that was the world. The lifespan in those days was 32. And so basically, what this is for you and your brother and the generations, if this is saved, to understand that where we are today and where we transcended. Now, my father was a taxi driver. I was the first person in our family to go into business. Now, since then, Norman went into business and Jeffrey went into business. But in this part of the family, we had a cousin, Sue, who was in the evening gown business with her husband. Sue died about 2 weeks ago. She was 83. But the point is, when I was a young man courting a girl, no, it's a different program. They wanted me to be a movie projectionist. Why? Well, what was I going to do? My father was a cab driver. I wasn't going to be a brain surgeon. I wasn't going to be a Spanish translator. What was I going to do? How was I going to make a living? And that was a big problem. And they said my aunt had a friend who was a projectionist in a theater. See, and today they had it done by computer. It turns on, it runs, it goes. In my time, it was a man in a booth in the back of the theater with an arc light, no lights. In order to get the strong picture on the screen, they had a burning arc of magnesium or something burning behind the film. And it would project. If the film stopped, you sit in the theater and see it burning. Because the film had to move, not to burn. But they would die up there because they would catch fire. Film was made out of celluloid. Celluloid burned, phew! And they got this arc. I think my aunt didn't like me. She wanted me to go become a projectionist. I said no. And my Uncle Arnold wanted me to take over his ladies' garment business. He had a business that could have fit on this table. He sold brush goods and panties, and we'll get to all that later. I worked for Arnold when I went to high school. I didn't even mention that. Arnold Sperber, he had a brush goods of these ladies' pajamas and robes that if you rub it, it's almost like a brushing. Someday I'll show it to you. And he had this little business, and he married my aunt. Talk about money and businesses. Arnold was in the underwear business, ladies' underwear, with his brother, Mr. Sperber, too, because two brothers had the same name. Depression hit, 1930, 31. They had no money. They needed, I think, $3,000 to stay in business. Arnold was going with my aunt, Ida, and he said, I have no money. If you can loan me, and she had, if you can loan me $3,000, I can stay in business with my brother-in-law. She said no. They broke up. He went out of the business, and the brother-in-law built a very large, successful underwear business. Arnold went into brush goods in a room one quarter the size of this living room. And I went to work for him, and he wanted me to take over the business. He was getting old. I said, Arnold used to save string. If a package came with string, he reused it in the boxes. Arnold was Arnold. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is, here during the Depression, $3,000 made the difference between survival and staying in business. And his brother had it. His brother didn't let him have it, I guess, and Arnold went on. And eventually he came back 10 years later, 15, married my aunt, and they went and lived happily ever after nowhere. Who knows? We'll get to that later. So, you hear, you see, your relatives, the street, the school. Imagine all of this going on. You are a street person because they're not up in your house. You come home from school, you have a glass of milk, and then you go down to the street. When you're a little child, 3, 4, 5, Helen, take David down to the street. It was always, if you lived in the front of the apartment house, your mother could watch you from the window. My mother had to go on the roof to call me. If she wanted you to come in for dinner, you saw that commercial years ago about in Boston, it's spaghetti night, and they called the little boy on it's advertising spaghetti. The mother goes to the window and he runs down the street for his spaghetti. Well, that's what they did in the old days. They called you from the window, Morris, it's dinner time. And from 4 flights up, you have to yell pretty loud for Morris to hear you in Chicago. So basically, but all of this blending into, you would walk into the house and you would smell the food from every apartment. No one bought, there was no frozen food, there was no refrigerators, we had ice boxes. So they would cook and cook. So imagine 16 flavors coming in the halls from everyone cooking. We didn't think about it at the time, it was part of life. So you take the neighborhood, the neighbors, the school, the streets, the social life, the ball, the war, and all of this, and where do you end up? You end up pretty much not knowing what you're going to do for a future. Because in the whole crowd of 22 guys, I think 4 guys went to college, or 3. Stanley went to college, became a teacher. What's his name went to college. He was and opened up a air conditioning company, did very well, and manufactured air conditioners. I don't remember his name. I've seen him lately, 20 years ago. And I think those are the only 2 guys who went to college. 20 guys did not. But a lot of them became very successful in business, in the garment center, ladies' clothing, and so on. Now, where are we now? We are probably have me at 17, 16. I was 14 in the last tape. All this was 2 years. Look what 2 years brought on.
We're going to need more tapes.
Look what 2 years brought on. Now, what happens? I'm working at Joe's. Soda, flipping eggs, bain-marie, tuna fish sandwich on toast, pop the toast, egg cream, soda, malted milk. All right. In comes a guy by the name of David. David. And he says, I got a business in textiles. I can give you a job after school. That sounds wonderful. I've promoted myself from soda jerk to textile manufacturer. But he wasn't a textile, he was a jobber. And him and his brother's name was Michael, and he was David. And I'll think of their last names one day. And I went, and they had one worker, an African American. Today he's an African American, back then he was a black man. But he was an African American. Nice, boy, really, we got a nice, wonderful guy. And what was my job? One, I went into this place, and it was a store. The whole store was buttons and ribbons, buttons and bows, buttons and bows, The ladies' garment center, the man in the front of the store was selling wholesale buttons for clothing, ribbons, and so on. Upstairs in the balcony of the store, ribbons and buttons, the man was selling. Listen to me very carefully, because there was a great education here. David and Michael had a little place behind a gate in the back of the store, which was no bigger than half the size of this room. Yeah, about half the size of this room. Maybe half the size of this room. And they would buy textiles, and then they would sell them to the cheapest skirt. You know, Henry Rosenfeld's and the big dress manufacturers of those days would buy from the mills, Celanese and this. These people would buy what they call seconds, damaged goods from the mills, and sell it to the skirt manufacturers who made the cheap skirts or the, okay. There's a lesson here, many lessons here, because this was during the war, I guess I didn't know it, but I was in the black market dress business because I was pushing dresses from a place on the roof of a building to other places on racks in the street, just pushing red dresses. During the war, the government determined how much you could sell a dress for, how much you could sell shoes for. It was called the OPA, Office of Price Administration. And you had a label, it said $9.99 or $6, and you couldn't sell it for anything else. What they did was they made dresses that weren't inspected, weren't labeled, and they sold them on the black market for $14.95 because you couldn't get hose, you couldn't get dresses, you couldn't get. And I think I was pushing those dresses through the garment center at 14 and 15 on this rack, delivering it after school. So I started out in school also in the garment center. And when I got out of high school, my first job was in printing, but I think a few months later, 3 months later, I was in the garment center working for Eddie Bayer in a blouse business. I was being trained to be a blouse salesman, and you carried his bag. They went with these big bags of blouses to the buying offices to sell the Macy's or the chains around, and you would carry it, and then they would go and hang it, and you'd break your neck. But, so I went to work for Eddie, who was a jobber. But let me go back to this other thing. So I spent a lot of my time in the garment center, ladies' clothing, 36th Street blouses, and I remember the names, Marlene Blouse. Today is a giant blouse company in China. They're making blouses by the billions. Henry Rosenfeld. I was a dress buyer later on at 18, 19, 20. She's looking like I'm crazy. But you see, what I was doing was, so I'm back now with Mike and David in the textile place, and where the lesson comes in. The guy who sold ribbons, he was a gambler. He had a nice camel's hair coat, and he'd go to the track every day. So after 6 months, we moved our gate, because he had no money, he was losing it at the track. We moved our gate 10 feet forward. We had a gate in the back so he couldn't get in there to the textiles. And then 6 months later, we moved the gate further. It ended up that he was in the back and Dave and Michael had the store, and then Dave and Michael split up and they had two stores. I don't know if they spoke to each other, but gambling loses the business. Gambling has destroyed more businesses, and you never gamble, outside, inside, or what, because this man with his camel hair coat ended up with nothing except horse racing ticket stubs. And David and Michael went on to take over. So, my life in the garment center, Larry built a blouse company, Click Blouse, very successful. He ended up closing it. He had a union problem, a stealing problem. He was paying off the buyers. I don't know. You see, the buyers had to get paid. Thievery. You want your blouses and Kleins? Something's for the buyers. See, the world out there was not, and is not. The Iraqis were paying the French to steal their oil right now, up until we attacked them. So this goes on. So here we were in the garment center. Stewie was in the blouse business, Larry, other people we met, and I was selling fabric. Now all of a sudden, here we are. Now where are we in age? 18, I went to work for a printer selling offset, which we do today, we print. I worked for an advertising agency, Shoshone, all these jobs, Shoshone Advertising Agency. What did I do with Shoshone Advertising? Sydney got me the job. It was after the war, they opened an advertising agency. Two guys, Shore and Shone, I guess, I don't know. Anyway, they had me going around, someone had the idea of perfume in a lipstick tube. So it looked like lipstick, but it was perfume. My job was to get it publicized. Let me finish. So I would take it out, and in the office buildings in New York, in the lobby, there are cigar stores, stands. I would have to get these placed there. And the only way I can get them placed is put them there on consignment, where they didn't have to pay me, and I'd come back. If they sold 5, I would get paid for 5. Didn't last very long. No one wanted lipstick perfume, and I got out of the advertising and perfume business quick. But I worked for a printer, and what did I do for the printer? Well, Offset was just being introduced, and he was going to build a giant company. He went out of business, never paid me, but I had to go and sell printing. So what did I do? I started on the top of a 20-story building and went down and visited every business. But I learned, because when I went to this business, and I went to that business, and I went to this business, I looked and I heard and I watched, and I made a storage up here in the computer. And when I worked at Abraham and Strauss, and the buyer would meet with the salesman in a little room with stock room on the side, I would go in and make believe I was working on stock, so I could listen to the conversation. So when the average stock clerk was, I don't know, goofing off, I was listening. And so all these experiences, which we haven't even touched on, the taxi work and all the other jobs, was coming into, not that there was a job there, but what I experienced in watching and learning and seeing and understanding. I worked for Eddie Bayer's brother, and there was a strike of Railway Express, and we had to take our packages to the post office to get it out to our stores. He had 8 stores, at least, but the post office in New York wouldn't take it because everyone was burying them. So I had to take them out to Long Island City. So you learn when there's a strike, you got problems, and you have a different kind of logistics of handling a business. It all doesn't run smooth. So I don't know what the 42 jobs were, 40, 41, but every one of them were important in experience. Okay, so where are we now? We are now through, I would have to say, almost 1949. We got the social life going on. Mother knows I took out Sobel Solar at 19. Why do I remember Sobel Solar? Who has a name like Sobel Solar? And I took it to the Roxy Theater, and I saw a state fair and a stage show. Well, that wasn't so long ago. It must have been 1949, which was a few days ago.
Yeah.
Sobel Solar. Okay. Was almost as bad as Doris Dobshinsky.
That's the
I mean,
worst.
you know, so we... but the point is this. War is over. We're going into a peacetime economy. You couldn't get a car during the war. You couldn't get a car. They didn't make any cars. They only made tanks. The war ended, and everyone wanted a car. Car was $800, $900, $1,200. I worked for Eddie Bayer, and so you would take your money, you'd go into a car dealership, you give him $300, and he'd tell you a year from now you're going to get a car. Well, they couldn't manufacture the cars that quick. He took the $300 from 1,000 people and put up a new building, which they eventually passed the law, you can't do that. So you can't take deposits and put up a building. But they were all building new buildings, and people were waiting a year. Eddie Bayer had a friend or knew somebody in Pontiac, Michigan. I think it was Buick was made there. So he got one of the executives, he paid him to drive a car from Pontiac to New York to deliver it. Eddie put him up in the hotel, paid all his expenses, and probably gave him a gift, so he got a car. So Eddie says to me, I'm 18 years old, I'm not even 19 yet, out of high school. And he said he's bringing his son with him. It's a miserable February, snowy, rainy day. He's bringing his son with him. And his son, I remember, likes hot chestnuts. So go out and get some hot chestnuts. 5 o'clock at night, I go through New York, I'm freezing. That stupid moron, the son comes in. Son is 21 years old. I figured this little kid I'm running chestnuts for. I almost killed him. But see, I learned everything. And like Eddie said to me, he was giving Christmas gifts to the buyers. And Eddie said, go out and buy 12 compacts. In those days, everyone got a compact. Lady, not a compact car. He said, but here's what you have to do. You have a budget of $5 for each one. Now, if they tell you for $5.10, they'll give you a solid gold one. You have a $5 budget. You don't pay $5.10. You pay a $5. And I don't want you to come back and tell me you spent $5.03. So right there I learned that when you have a budget for something, you got to live with the budget. And I brought Eddie back $5 compacts for his buyers. But you see, I haven't told this story here. It was like Joe's Luncheonette. Joe was paying me 12 cents an hour. And if you worked at night, you were 12, 13 years old. And every night, Joe, once or twice a week, would take us out to Coney Island, to Nathan's. He had a car. And Erminie was his wife. And by the way, I called his wife about 5 years ago. I looked her up in the book, and she said, Joe just died, and we lost our son. It was very sad. And I invited her to come down as my guest here, and she never came. And they were very nice to me. So they would take us out at night after work to have hamburgers at Toomey's or Rockaway or Coney Island. And we went to Joe, it was Jerry Price and I, and we said, Joe, 12 cents an hour is not fair. We work 4 hours, we have 48 cents. You sometimes get some tips, but we want 20 cents an hour. And it's very important in my business. I've used it 100 times. And Joe said, you are my friends, huh? You are my friends. You're holding me up for 20 cents an hour? I said, but Joe, you take us to Toomey's and you spend for the hot dogs and the hamburgers. He said, let me tell you something. That's my pleasure. This is my business. And I don't pay 20 cents an hour. So we didn't get a raise. We got a hot dog. But the difference between what you do in your life and how you treat your business was Joe's. And Joe, when I was 16 years old, gave me a silver dollar. It's framed in the garage right now with a hole in it. And he said, you will never hold on to a dollar. This is the only dollar you will ever hold on to. And that was 60 years ago. And it's inside on the wall. Stephen wants me to give it to him. And if he holds it for 10 years, I'd give him $100,000. But he said, no. Mitchell had it for years, and I gave him I said, if you hold it for 10 years, I'll give you $1,000 or something. He gave it back to me in 10 years. But the point I'm getting at, these are experiences, Tricia. These are, I mean, the Joe, the Erminie, the hot dogs, and it all comes down to, without those experiences, I couldn't be in business. That's a nice music back here. It's okay. It won't show up that well. So where are we now? We're probably 19 years old. We haven't got far to go. We have 50 some odd more years to go, which We should wrap it up because the tape is almost over, right? Okay, we're going to wrap it up at 19, and we're going to cut to another tape. Thank you.
Because I have to go to the bathroom.